Hello everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. The Treasures of Reading is my wrap-up of the books I have read in the past period. My last wrap-up covered 92 days of reading, in which I read 10 books, almost 5,300 pages altogether. This episode covers the period starting on September 20 and ending on October 30. On this chart, you can see the titles of my most recent reads. During those 40 days, I read 8 books with a total page count of 3,191 to be precise. 2 of those were non-fiction, 1 was a classic, and the other 5 were fantasy. The average score of these 8 books is 85.5 points out of 100. Which is just half a point shy of 4.5 stars. I have truly experienced the treasure of reading these past 40 days. Nothing but good books. Some of them are small and may perhaps not even be called a book. Still, with an average page count of almost 400, I don't mind using the term book for all 8 of them. For those of you who are interested, at the end of this video, you can watch the complete overview of all the fantasy books I have read since the beginning of my journey into fantasy, starting at January 2023. Let's take a closer look at each title. So far, I have done a separate video on 3 of them. There is really nothing more I have to say on Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson than I already did in my reading vlog, which, by the way, was my longest video to date. I rambled on for more than 1 hour about all the things that stood out for me during my read. A great read, and one that only strengthened my love for this writer. If you want to hear more details about my reading experience, please check out that video. Each Stormlight book has a very high pickup ability, I would say around 90%. But I did read one other book with a higher pickup ability than that. I gave Words of Radiance the same rating as The Way of Kings, namely 97 points out of 100, a true 5 stars. This makes Words of Radiance my most precious reading treasure of the past 40 days. At this moment, I am about 25% into Oathbringer. It is too soon to say anything substantial about my reading experience for this book, but so far I get the distinct feeling that this book in the Stormlight Archive is going to be my favorite. We'll see if that assumption will hold up. During Words of Radiance, I read the classic by Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea. Being caught up in a 1,300-page book at some point gave me the feeling of being imprisoned. To break out of that, I picked up one of the shortest books on my TBR. In July of 2021, so 1.5 years before I happily let myself get sucked into the fantasy genre in January of 2023, I realized that I had never read anything by this great writer. That omission had to be remedied immediately, so I bought 3 books by Hemingway. I started reading A Farewell to Arms. The novel was published in 1929 when the writer was 30 years of age. So far, I have not officially DNF'd this book, but I also haven't finished reading it yet. It was a struggle to get through the first 75 pages, which is where I'm at right now. Nothing stood out to me. I underlined almost nothing, and all the time I mainly wondered why I had to read this story, which can hardly be called a story really. In the meantime, I read other books like a couple of Arthur Ransom's, The Fall by Steve Taylor, which is a magnificent book about the origins of the patriarchy and the way that this has led humanity down the path of hatred and war. And I also read When Nietzsche Wept by Irvin Yalom, a clever and intelligent novel that also irritated me somewhat because of the author's tendency to explain his cleverness to the reader. During those and some other books, I only picked up A Farewell to Arms occasionally out of obligation, not because I really wanted to read the book. Talking about an extreme low pickup ability. How different was my experience with The Old Man and the Sea. Such an enchanting and raw story about Santiago and his plight with the big fish he catches and the sea. Again, not many underlinings, but simply a very nice reading experience. I gave The Old Man and the Sea, with its only 99 pages, 83 points out of 100. I doubt if I'll ever finish reading A Farewell to Arms, but I may just give the third Hemingway book I bought, For Whom the Bell Tolls, a go. Who knows? After reading Words of Radiance, which I finished on October 4, I was in the mood for some shorter books, or something completely different. Each book in the Stormlight Archive I've read so far took me 16 days to finish. I predict that Oathbringer will take me even longer. It is always nice to storm through a book in just a couple of days and then move on to the next. Stormlight is great and a lifetime experience, but it is also demanding. So, for something completely different than the many mysteries surrounding the Knights Radiant, the Spren, and all the different creatures on Roshar, I picked up On the Move, A Life, which is the autobiography by Oliver Sacks. This book was published shortly before he passed away in August of 2015. It had been on my shelves since then. I read several books by this writer and neurologist, which I enjoyed immensely, like Hallucinations, Musicophilia, The Mind's Eye, and of course his most famous book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. I got stuck in his rather scientific book about migraine, and my shelves still hold 4 other unread books of his. Reading On the Move has certainly inspired me to pick those up very soon. With just under 400 pages, this is not really a short book, but it was an easy read for the most part. Sacks can be very humorous when he's writing about his clumsiness, which more than once got him into serious trouble in his life. The several stories about his friends and the early passing of some of them were beautiful and heartbreaking. I particularly enjoyed his deeply felt love for and friendship with his Aunt Lenny, who, according to some of the letters of her, Sacks quotes, was a very gifted writer herself. It also was very nice to read about the genesis of many of his books. Unfortunately, Sacks is without restraint at times when it comes to the scientific side of his profession. Not just the many medical terms threw me off, but his pages-long and detailed exploration of something that is utterly abracadabra for lay people like myself. If an editor had protected the author and the reader better in this respect, this book would have scored much higher. Still, I had a great time reading it, with a very high pickup ability of 90%. I can give On the Move, A Life, 77 points out of 100, which is a good 4 stars. This break of about 1 week from Roshar was enough to make me want to go back there again. In a separate video, I talk in length about my reading experience of 2 of Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere Novellas, collected in Arcanum Unbounded. I first read Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell, a beautifully titled and ditto story. It is only 61 pages long in my edition, but even with so few pages at his disposal, the author manages to summon up an entire world, as always leaving the reader with a ton of questions. Edge Dancer, which many of you recommended I should read before continuing with Oathbringer, also was a great story. I liked it a little less than Shadows for Silence because it seemed rather directionless for a large portion of it. Nevertheless, 2 very nice reading experiences. Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell scored 86 points out of 100, and Edge Dancer 79 points out of 100. For more, check out my other video. My next read was another Discworld novel, the fourth installment in the series, Mort. Even though I didn't like Equal Rights, Discworld books are without exception nice breaks from whatever else it is I'm reading. At the moment I'm working on the script for a separate video on this one, but what I can say at this point is that Mort is the best Terry Pratchett I have read up until now. I've read 8 so far, starting with Guards in March of 2023. I liked The Wee Free Men, the first of the Tiffany Aching sequence, best with 78 points out of 100. But now Mort is the leader. The first 3 novels and number 8, Guards, in my experience hardly contained a real story. Mort does. Anyway, please hang on until I have the dedicated Mort video ready. I rated Mort 84 points out of 100, which is a solid 4 stars. The next book I read, this one is in Dutch, and I have published a short video on it called A Short Autobiographical Interlude. In my younger days, I read many books with correspondence, diaries, and other works with so-called ego documents. This book holds the letters between my favorite Dutch author Jeroen Brouwers and a publisher-writer Geert van Oorschot. Both men were extremely disillusioned with the literary establishment here in the Netherlands and Belgium, and they complain and nag constantly about it. But they do so with much nihilism and humour. One of Brouwers' early novellas is called Zonder trommels en trompetten, which would literally translate as Without Drums and Trumpets. He explains the origin of this title. Lodewijk van Dijssel, a Dutch writer from the beginning of the 20th century, received a manuscript from a young author with a request that the master read it, and also with a request if the master could think of a title for it. Van Dijssel wrote to the young writer, "Dear Sir, please let me know whether drums and trumpets appear in your book." The young writer wrote back, "No, Mr. Van Dijssel, they do not appear in it." To which Van Dijssel wrote back, "Well then, dear sir, call your book Without Drums and Trumpets?" I flew through the almost 600 pages of this book and even put down Oathbringer for a couple of days because of it. In terms of pick-up ability, I would say this book scored 100%. It is my second best treasure of this period with 90 points out of 100. The final book of this wrap-up I listened to on audio. Since hearing that many booktubers listen to books, I thought to give that a try as well. I now have listened to the Duncton Chronicles, a trilogy about moles written by William Howard. Even though I very much liked to revisit these books of my childhood, they took me forever to listen to. Now, in less than 4 weeks' time, I listened to The Hobbit, narrated by Andy Serkis. This was an absolute delight. I bought my physical copy of the English version of this book in October of 1984. As you can see, it falls apart, not because I've read it so many times, I believe I only read it twice, but simply because of the bad quality. Listening to this story on audio brought it back to life again in a completely new way. It is impossible for me to not see the movie before my eyes while listening to the story, especially where Andy Serkis does his Gollum voice. I still don't quite understand why so many people don't like the movies, because I believe Peter Jackson and his team did an excellent job of telling this story while integrating much of the bigger story, which is hardly mentioned in the book. Just a great audio experience. I'm now listening to the first of the Lord of the Rings books, also narrated by Andy Serkis. These books deserved a reread for some time now. Audio is great for that. I gave The Hobbit in audio 87 points out of 100. So these are the 8 books I have read in the last 40 days. I'm thankful that almost everything I read is good to very good. For the next weeks, I will be imprisoned by Oathbringer, on a voluntary basis, of course. I believe that I will abandon my bold plan to have read all 4 of the Stormlight Archive books before the 5th installment, Wind and Truth, comes out this December. The fun in reading always trumps the inner need to achieve goals. In the end, it doesn't matter if I read a certain book later than right after its publication. That was one of the things I hated when I wrote book reviews back in the day. The pressure of time can be an absolute killjoy when it comes to reading books. Enough said. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.